In our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, we discuss a variety of sensitive subjects such as suicide, suicidal ideation, self harm, abuse, and faith crisis. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi, welcome to our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, presented by Pause Wellness. I'm your host, Eric Stauffer. I'm very pleased to welcome our guest, our wonderful therapist, Jill Dickey. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Eric.
How are we doing?
Doing great.
Good. So this is our first episode. We're going to
Yeah.
dive into our first topic together, and so we've hopefully you've already seen our introductory video that tells you about our biweekly or so podcast here. But Jill, why don't you introduce to us what our topic is for today?
Well, Eric and I have decided to discuss the concept and idea of perfectionism, something that I think many of our listeners struggle with and deal with in their life, or at least know somebody who does. It can be a pervasive thing. And I just finished reading a wonderful book by an author and therapist. Her name is Katherine Morgan oh my goodness, I can't say her last name. Schaeffler. Why is that hard? I don't know. Anyway, it's
Katherine Morgan
called,
Schaeffler.
yeah, Katherine Morgan Schaeffler. And I like to give credit to her for a lot of these ideas that we're going to discuss today because I think she has a beautiful framework for working with perfectionism. Her book is called The Perfectionist's Guide to Losing Control. So if you like what we talk about today, that is a resource you can grab and learn more than what we're able to cover in the podcast.
That's awesome. Before we dive into that, let me just ask you a quick question. So, why do you think that I mean, we could be talking about a kind of a religious Orthodox type culture, but why do you think that so many of our listeners would have a tendency to struggle with perfectionism?
Well, I think religion can play a role in how perfectionism comes about, but I don't think it's specifically a religious problem. Many people struggle with perfectionism that aren't religious or aren't part of a religious culture or group. And so it's something that as human beings we kind of fall into, especially when we have certain temperaments and personality types that kind of lean towards perfectionistic tendencies.
That's a great description. So, sometimes our listeners might think that it's strictly a religious type side effect or just but it doesn't have to be, right? Because
Yeah.
that's more scrupulosity is probably the more proper term for a religious implication of it. Is
I'd make
that accurate?
maybe a little bit of a tweak there is that scrupulosity, perfectionism can lead to a diagnosis of scrupulosity type OCD, but you can be perfectionist and not have scrupulosity.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they do tend to go hand in hand often.
Okay. That helps. That helps me a lot, and it'll help our listeners understand that too. So what do you notice about it? What do you know about perfectionism? Are you a perfectionist yourself?
Oh, I'm a recovering perfectionist, but I'm hoping to give a framework here today that will help us think a little bit differently about perfectionism. So, Eric, when I say that word to you, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah. I do think in terms of obsessive compulsive disorder for sure. Um,
Mhm.
kind of like really compulsive behaviors to either appear to be perfect or to not have problems, or like we have this quest for worthiness or needing to be a certain level of our lives under control for our own satisfaction or for the perception that we're wanting. And I don't know how accurate that is in a DSM-4, but that's just kind of how I see it from a social perspective.
Well, first of all, we're on the DSM-5. So,
Five.
what's interesting about what you're saying is that the
Hey,
perfectionism is
your first
not,
jab, Jill. Just that's great. You got your first
it's
jab in.
5, Eric. They're
I'm
working on
behind on the
6.
times, the DSM-5. That's right.
It's totally okay. You're not expected to know that.
That's right.
Um, it's interesting that you say that and you brought up the DSM because perfectionism is not in the DSM. It's not a clinical diagnosis, right? But you do mention one, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. And like I said earlier, perfectionistic tendencies can, you know, be linked to people with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a clinical diagnosis, but they are not necessarily one and the same.
Mm,
Okay. You can have obsessive compulsive disorder and not be a perfectionist. All right. And so I want to talk about perfectionism outside of the clinical diagnosis of like obsessive compulsive disorder.
awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
Generalize it a little bit more. And what I want to do is, as you were describing it, what came to mind is that there's kind of this negative connotation that you kind of give it as you talk about it. And most people do. Like this perfectionism is this negative thing. And as Katherine Morgan Schaeffler does in her book, I want to give this a little bit of a different spin. Okay. And I want to propose that perfectionistic tendencies can be a good thing.
Mm,
All right. Um, there's something in all of us as human beings that wants to strive towards an ideal. We like to grow, we like to stretch, we like to expand, we like to develop. And in order to do that, we've got to have some sort of idea about what we're striving towards, some sort of target. Okay. So it's not necessarily wrong in any way to be striving towards an ideal. And we want that. And some people have strong tendencies towards perfectionism and striving for this ideal, meaning they're really good at seeing the world through a lens like this. Here's what is going on, and here's what the ideal is. And I would like to close that gap.
yes, something I'm always talking about. We have this reality and we have this ideality, and we don't know how to bridge that gap. And sometimes it feels like the ideal gets so often emphasized, and then we see that gap, and then we feel like we're failing because the gap seems so big to us.
Exactly. And that's where you get kind of the negative connotation of perfectionism.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about two types of perfectionism because again, I don't want to demonize this idea that striving towards an ideal is a bad thing. It can be a really good thing to want to do that. And it's very normal in human beings to want to strive towards an ideal. Okay. So let's talk about two kinds of perfectionism because what really helps is to be able to differentiate between the two types and which one is alive in you and which one has the steering wheel. Okay.
Okay, can I be the
Oh,
guinea pig for this then? Since I
sure.
feel like I have these tendencies, right? We
Yeah,
can try to see which one I more identify with and what that might do.
sure. Okay. So the two types we're going to call the first type healthy perfectionism or adaptive perfectionism. Okay. And this type of perfectionist understands that an idea or an ideal is meant to inspire. All right. And to give us a goal to extend towards and not necessarily to reach. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I'm working with people, I'll often have them imagine like an archery target, the typical one, and that we need that bullseye to kind of give us an idea of what we're aiming at,
Right.
right? But arrows are going to fly all over the place in our attempts to grow and develop. All right. So we need something to strive for, but healthy perfectionists realize that reaching that perfection, that state of perfection, whatever that may mean, is not really the goal. Okay. Any questions about that kind?
Yeah, so you're saying that we all need this vision, or we all need this target, but it's not, but it's the target that keeps a focus rather than a destination. Is that, am I saying that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. As I described the second type, this will make more sense. Okay.
Okay,
So now
yeah.
we've got our second type of perfectionism. And these type of perfectionists are maladaptive perfectionism or unhealthy perfectionism. Okay. These types of perfectionists conflate ideals with goals. All right. So they
Explain
see
that.
an ideal in their mind and it's the same as a goal, and it must be reached for them to be okay with
Mm.
who they are.
Me, me, me.
Okay.
Oh, our favorite, what about Bob? Bob Wiley. I'm really,
Me?
Oh wait,
B.
no, that's Groundhog Day. I got that way off. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's what, okay. Yeah,
Really
that's right.
close on this one. Yeah.
I'm really close on this one. Yeah, you are really close on this one. I mean, to be honest, I think that because human beings are really complicated, we don't like to flatten ourselves out that much, right? I think people have both kinds alive and well in them,
Yeah.
right? So it's not I'm one or the other.
Right.
The idea is which type of perfectionism am I operating in now, in this
At this
moment?
moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This comes up so often on the podcast. It's this kind of binary mindset where we think it's either this or this. And
Hmm.
and we would serve ourselves better if we looked for understanding on a spectrum rather than just one or the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. Um, in clinical terms, we call that dichotomous thinking,
Yes.
right? Or black and white thinking.
Yeah.
I'm either all bad or all good.
Yeah.
You know, I often tell people to work on a scale around this. Okay, if one is all bad and 10 is all good, and we're only good at working at the edges of that scale, right? How can we work with ourselves to learn how to find the messy middle,
Yeah.
somewhere in the middle? Okay, because that in that well-being goes up when we can figure out how to work in that messy middle. But
Yes.
yeah, perfectionists often struggle. Unhealthy perfectionism is a struggle with a lot of times dichotomous thinking. It's either we're perfect or we're worthless.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Well, if
So,
I'm going for the target, if I've got the target and I'm learning to balance the healthy versus the unhealthy.
mhm.
So let's say that that's my goal now. So what's your guidance on that?
Okay. So I want you to just notice a little bit more. So I'm going to say a little bit more about each type.
Yeah.
Okay. If you are struggling in a maladaptive or unhealthy perfectionist mindset, you will be struggling with a lot of feelings of anxiety and shame. Unhealthy maladaptive perfectionism does not feel good inside. There's a
Right.
lot of anxiety because we're just so worried about earning our value and our worth and making sure that we're enough and that we're okay. And there's a lot of anxiety in that, right? And then
Yeah.
when we can't quite hit that target, we feel a lot of shame around it. When you are in a healthy perfectionistic mindset, you're inspired, you're excited, you're feeling creative and energized. There is some stress in there. It's not perfectly anxiety free, but it's like the productive kind of anxiety that keeps you moving forward towards an important ideal, right? Or striving towards some sort of goal.
Yeah.
But it's not, you're not miserable and you're not swimming in a lot of anxiety that's hard to handle. And there certainly isn't shame attached to the healthy type of
Okay.
perfection.
So let me bring this to personal experience. So I remember having a conversation with you recently, and we were discussing like my professional pursuits or the different things that I was involved with, right? And you asked a question something like, uh, you really need to look into why you're doing what you're doing.
Mm.
Do you remember this? Do you remember
I do.
mentioning
You're
this?
you're so good at this, Eric. You're walking me right into what I wanted to say next. Keep going.
Okay, so yeah, because I really that's kind of something I've really been pondering a lot lately is as an educator, there's a huge temptation to inhale the praise or the feedback that you get, especially if it's positive. If it's negative, it's like you just kind of eat yourself up and you have to almost like dismiss it unless it really can help you. And so it's this kind of battle back and forth of feeling gratitude for positive feedback and how do you leverage the negative to improvement and those kinds of things. And then there's that side, the just the feedback wrestle. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's also like, okay, so if I really like positive feedback or praise, how do I not turn that, how do I prevent myself from turning that into an addiction?
Mm-hmm. Great questions.
An unhealthy desire for praise that means I'm not really like my pursuit of perfectionism is maladaptive.
Yeah.
Like I'm wanting this praise to prove my worth because I don't believe in my worth.
Mm,
And I know that that is my temptation
yeah.
for me personally. I
Yeah.
know that I have a hard time with that. And so I do again, I don't think that I'm always dichotomous in that, but I probably am more often than not. And so I need to have less maladaptive I guess motives in what I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing. Does
Yeah,
that all make sense?
I love the question. I love the question because it gives us a lot to explore. All right. And I think a lot of people can relate to you. I know I certainly can relate. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is I also want to acknowledge that praise and positive feedback feels really good. We
Yes,
all like it,
you're
right?
really you're really good at that, Jill.
Thanks, Eric. So are you. Okay. I really like it, especially when the people I admire and want to be close to think well of me and give me positive feedback, it feels really good. Validation feels really nice to get. And there's nothing wrong with getting validation. I hope you get a lot of it in your life. And I hope that we give it to others because it's such a lovely way to be kind to other people and to help them see how we appreciate them and how we notice them. So validation in and of itself is not a bad thing. But something that you're pointing to, I think, in your comment, Eric, is somebody who tends to be really dependent on that to feel good about themselves,
Right.
right? They struggle to feel good about who they really are and what their core worth and value is if they're not getting that feedback. And so a lot of times this is the soil that perfectionism can grow in
Right.
because people will get this idea, man, if I don't get this just right, if I don't do this just perfectly, then people won't love me and I won't be worth anything. I won't be valuable, right? You know you're in a maladaptive mindset around perfectionism when those thoughts are present. All right. Because nobody's worth is in question. It just is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And performance can't change that and never will.
See, and if you don't mind me just injecting a little faith comment there. So depending on your faith tradition, um from a lot of the faiths, not just Latter-day Saint faith, which is my background, but other faiths that I've interacted with and people of other faiths that I've interacted with, there really is kind of a foundational silver lining of that your worth is not something that you have to prove. That in Christian thought, it's that the Savior Jesus Christ paid the price, and that price is impossible to calculate. And because of that price, it lets you know of your worth. And so you can't outrun this thing. You can't something we've talked about on the podcast. You can't out sin this thing even. And so there is a just from the faith concept that when we start to doubt what that worth actually is, then we start asking questions like, okay, so have I proven myself enough to be loved?
Hmm.
Because I'm doubting it. I start to get concerned as to whether or not I will be loved unless I've achieved a certain level of lovingness.
Hmm. So there's three things I want to say about that. Okay. The first one is this is why having a relationship to a higher power, whatever that may be for you, can be a beautiful thing. Because if we're trying to figure out who we are and what our value is, a reflection from a divine source can be a beautiful way to learn that. Okay. And I hope that we all learn that somewhere along the line. But I want to also say that, like, yes, it's nice to have, to say to somebody, your value is infinite.
Mm.
God knows your worth and it's not in question. You don't have to do anything to prove it. And it's one thing to say that to a person, but it's another thing altogether to take that in and really believe it in the core of you, especially when we don't live in a world where that's how we think about things and about people. And so I want to emphasize that it's a developmental skill and reality that we can learn and get better at doing.
That's so
It's
good.
understanding that. Yeah.
That's so good because the problem, the crossroads where I see it happen so often is that we have a tendency to believe that this will work, that worth is infinite and good for other people, but then to really believe it about ourselves is a stretch for so many of us. And
Yes.
that seems to be how you can tell whether or not it has developed in you. Like, is it a part of you? Because
Yeah, we're really good
you're
at,
gonna, yeah, if you're going to proclaim that in other people, then without hypocrisy, you've got to believe that about yourself.
well, yes, I mean that would be the dream, right? The goal.
Right.
But we're just very good at making ourselves the exception to the human condition,
Yeah.
right? And there's a reason for that. And this leads me to the third thing that I was going to say is that this idea of our value being in question, this is challenging for most people because we grow up in social systems, okay? Our families, our schools, our neighborhoods, our religious institutions, the broader culture, right?
Sporting events,
Yeah,
the
sporting
art.
events. Yeah. And a lot of times these systems are not necessarily welcoming of who we are. Okay. And there in these systems, there are real or perceived conditions on you being you. Right. And then we also have this deep need to be cared for and in connection with other people. Right. So somewhere along the line, we learn that there's certain things about us that aren't okay in those systems,
Yeah.
those imperfect systems, right? And then we desperately want to be connected in our group and with our families and our friends and the groups that we belong to. We're going to try to figure that out, right? Okay, well, how do I need to organize myself? How do I need to be in order to be acceptable? And this is a big question that we're asking. And here's where perfectionism comes in and takes root, the unhealthy kind,
Yeah.
right?
This is why I was so fascinated. This is why my undergrad is in sociology. Is this stuff intrigued me so much. You have the individual psychology of an individual, but there is a crossroads as we interact with communities and social systems, and the more we can understand in that process, the more we'll understand ourselves.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It's true. And so this is where we've got to just raise our awareness. Okay. And like I said, it's a developmental skill to figure all of this stuff out. It takes time and practice and awareness and understanding.
So if you were to give me just some basic ideas about developing a healthy approach to that, how would you do that?
Well, let's do it in the frame of the unhealthy type of perfectionism. Okay.
Okay.
Let's say we notice this in ourselves as you're listening to me and to Eric, and you're thinking, oh man, yeah, I do that. I fall into this place of unhealthy perfectionism where I'm trying to earn my value. And there's a lot of anxiety and I'm experiencing a lot of shame and I can't quite get there. And I just feel miserable and I don't know how to stop. Okay. Here's two questions you can ask yourself. All right. Um, the first one is, how am I striving? All right. Is the way I'm striving hurting me or the people around me? And what does that look like? Am I forcing my standards on others or am I beating myself up when I can't meet the ideal?
Yeah.
Because
So
because striving is good, but how are you striving?
yeah.
Okay. And then the second question is, why am I striving? Am I striving to earn worthiness? I'll be okay if I do X or Y. Okay. At least noticing and answering those questions can help you know where you need to reevaluate.
So if I'm asking myself the why I'm striving, and I
Mhm.
feel that that motive is good, innately good and healthy, but I manifest it in unhealthy ways. So do you get what I'm asking? Like
Mm,
the first question you asked, I thought, okay, I can see that I've got some unhealthy, maladaptive uh, intentions. But then
mhm.
as I look at the macro, like my real intention, like I really know that I have that my focus or that bullseye is right where I want to be. Not that I want to achieve the bullseye, but I know that my focus is really, really good. And so it's like I have, for me, it's like it's like I feel I feel like I'm just dancing around in a circle on this. I know that my motive is good, but my practice of that motive is not healthy.
Right. So you're saying I like the ideal I'm striving
Yes,
towards.
yes, exactly.
Okay. But the way I'm in relationship to that ideal and to myself is unhealthy.
Yeah, it's almost like I've developed these behaviors to try to prove myself that, hey, you're heading towards that goal. You're heading towards that bullseye.
Hmm.
But it's not healthy the way that I keep proving it to myself.
Right. And so your question is, how do you stop doing that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to answer your two questions, what if you've got positive one and negative another, or is it not even possible?
I think I'm thinking about your question. I think the ideal is just there, right?
Yeah.
And, we don't have time for this, but if you get the book, it'll talk about different types of perfectionism. Okay. And you can even type yourself and say, oh, I tend to be this kind of perfectionist or this
Hmm.
kind of perfectionist. And when you understand that, there's a quiz in the book that you can take. Okay. I always love giving out resources and books where people can learn more in depth, right?
More
So you
like
can
a
go find out, okay,
self-diagnosis kind of a test.
yeah, kind of like, okay, I tend to be, this type of perfectionist. And so that means my ideals look more like this, okay? Because that may vary from person to person. And the ideal isn't the problem, it's how you're in relationship to it. So to answer your question, I would say, first of all, when you notice you're doing this, okay, I can answer, oh, yeah, I'm striving in this not healthy way. I'm, really hard on other people because I'm hard on myself, right? And this doesn't look good. And I am trying to earn my value. That's why I'm doing this. And it's causing me all kinds of anxiety because I can't do that. It may seem like I can do that, but I can't do it. Okay. And so the first thing that I would say is you need to give yourself some compassion. Okay. Don't step into the trap of beating yourself up because you've got this unhealthy perfectionist mindset. Because, like I said, we all have some of this if we have perfectionistic tendencies, right? So give yourself compassion and grace for finding yourself there because it's an easy place to be, right? Because, like I said, we're all trying to figure out who we are in this messy world. And so we need to give ourselves some grace and compassion to start, right?
Yeah. So let me just give you a little pushback on that for just a second, just for
Hmm.
the variety of listeners that we might have.
Hmm.
So oftentimes a narrative that I'll hear is if we keep if we it's on I always call it like the participation trophy concept, right? Like if I'm too compassionate to myself or to other people, then I'm going to soften them and they're going to have a failure to strive, like a failure to thrive kind of an idea, right?
Hmm.
So now that narrative drives me crazy. I'm not okay with it. In fact, I will I've got some friends of mine who they know when they kind of say that to me, I think, okay, so I'm just going to throw out the concept of compassion because I'm not going to be tough enough for you. And I don't know, maybe that's insensitive, but I really struggle with that, Jill. It bothers me a lot that there is that narrative out there that says, hey, if you're too compassionate, then you're just going to enable people and they're going to be, they're never going to really develop into anything because they're going to be too soft.
Mm. Yeah, it frustrates me too, that narrative. And I suppose, if we really look at it, there may be people who are quote unquote using self-compassion to just not care about, and
Sure.
just that could happen. But
Right.
that's not my experience with people.
It's kind of
My,
like saying that, if we have a welfare system that is meant to help people in need that cannot provide for themselves, well, there's going to be people who take advantage of that. So we might as well not have a welfare system. I'm not trying to speak politically. I'm just talking
Mhm.
from the concept of that. We
Sure. I mean,
we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
yeah. And my experience, like I said, with people has been very different. as in my work with clients, what I see is not too much compassion, but not even nearly enough for the challenge of being human. And when people learn how to give themselves compassion and grace, they do not shut down and stop functioning. They do not stop striving for good and an ideal. They just stop doing it in anxious, shame-filled ways, right?
I love that, Jill, so much because it's kind of like there's a phrase that we use in our faith, charity never faileth.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we think that charity will spoil. And I just don't, that's not been in my Nate. I mean, maybe I'm different, but when someone is kind to me and compassionate to me, I don't think, now I can relax. I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
work toward anything. I don't have to develop. I don't have to become. It's not that way at all.
Well, how do you feel?
I feel love for that person and
Mm-hmm.
I start to love myself more.
And then when you love yourself more, how do you behave?
Well, I just want to do better. I feel confident in myself. I feel like I can do more and I don't have to do it to prove anything.
Yeah, you want to just do good in the world,
That's right.
right?
That's
And,
right.
and that's been my experience. Well, when you infuse people's lives with grace and compassion and love and charity, the opposite of what we're afraid is going to happen happens,
So
right? I'll tell
yeah,
you what I do know,
yeah,
and
go
this
ahead.
is what we can prove in all kinds of scientific data, is that punishing the self, berating the self, and using punishment to motivate never works. Never.
I want our listeners to just kind of resonate in that for just a second. So the data shows that the negative punishing, kind of domineering approach to our self, the data shows how negative that is.
Yes.
And yet, does the data show that the opposite has the opposite effect?
Yes. So punishment, I think of it as like this. Punishment is something that we do to create pain. Okay, so think about it. If you're doing something to yourself or to another person to create pain, pain is already being felt. So pain on top of pain. It just doesn't feel very motivating. When I've done it to myself, it hasn't worked.
Right.
It's only made things worse, right?
Right.
So what I encourage people to do, here's an exercise that was in the book. Um, it was very interesting. Write the word punishment on a piece of paper and its definition, something we do to cause pain. Okay. And then we want to use maybe some different words that we can write on that paper. Here's some different ways to think about it: natural consequences, developing, discipline, rehabilitation, personal accountability, human growth,
Becoming.
becoming. That's another great word. Okay. Let's throw punishment out the door
Right.
and let's get used to using those kinds of vocabulary words when
Yeah.
it comes to working with ourselves around improvement and growth and working around the mistakes that we often make in
Right.
this process. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from the religious perspective, again, another fear that I think we have is if you remove punishment, then you say there is no law. And if you say there's no law, then there's no God, there's no right, and there's no wrong. That doesn't mean necessarily if you're throwing out punishment that there isn't natural consequence. That's the phrase you just
Right.
mentioned, right? So
Right.
we can still have this, yes, there's going to be negative consequence. Yes, there's going to be pain, but it's not self-inflicted and it's not going to be necessarily putting you you know it's not going to make it so you're entitled, but
Mm-hmm.
pain from natural consequence does teach us a lesson, and it helps us to know which direction to go, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
have to self-induce that. It will come naturally.
Yes, are you familiar with the idea in Buddhist psychology about the second arrow?
No.
So there's the Buddhists teach this that there's your first arrow suffering and your second arrow suffering. First arrow suffering is the pain and suffering that's inherent in being human, in the struggle of being human, right? And we all experience that because life has so many challenges and difficulties, and some of those challenges and difficulties are painful, right?
Yeah.
But the second arrow we do to ourselves
Mm.
by doubling down in this kind of punishment mindset to either ourselves or to others. So we create more suffering on top of that inherent suffering that's part of life. And we want to watch for that and become aware of when we're doing that.
That's so interesting because you think about today's world with social media, and when we're assuming that others don't even have the first narrow thinking, what first arrow, first
First
narrow,
arrow,
first
like you're
arrow.
shooting an arrow. Yeah.
Yeah. So if people think that they don't have first arrow, so we're making a false assumption that others don't experience pain. And then we go, oh, what's wrong with me? I've got pain all the time. And then we add the second arrow on top of that. So you've got this huge contrast between reality and this ideal way of thinking that is
Mhm.
negative.
And again, we all do this.
Yeah.
We're not pathologizing this. This is normal. This is what it's like to be human. What we need to do is just raise our awareness around when we're doing that,
Yeah.
right?
That's so good. That
So, can we talk about the word perfect for a second? Because I think that
yeah.
there's some interesting things to think about there.
Yeah.
Okay. When you hear the word perfect, what do you think about?
Without flaw, never made a mistake, um, without blemish, just
Okay,
perfect. Everything, yeah, there's no flaw. Pure.
great. That's what most people think about when they hear the word perfect, right? Um, and I think that understanding of the word perfect got started in the Industrial Revolution
Hmm.
when machines were invented that could pop out perfect products that were flawless and symmetrical and perfect.
Hmm.
Okay. And so that's where that this understanding of perfect as flawless started to crawl into our vocabulary and understanding.
Yeah, that's interesting because the other thought that came to my mind was in metalwork, like
Hmm.
purity, like
Hmm.
working out the impurities of the metal so until it's perfect and pure.
Yes, exactly. And that wasn't something that could really be accomplished until we had these machines that could do this, right?
Right.
But the word perfect means to be whole or complete. Okay, so I want you to think about a machine-made product. Like everyone's got a 3D printer these days, like some perfect thing that your 3D printer pops out. And then I want you to think about like a beautiful handmade piece of pottery or a beautiful painting that your kid makes at school. I mean, handmade items are precious, right? They're even more expensive. Like, oh, handmade. This is handmade, a handmade quilt, a handmade bowl,
Yeah.
a handmade dress, a handmade loaf of bread, right? What's beautiful about those handmade objects?
It's the personal touch. It's
Yeah.
it cannot be recreated by someone else because it was only created by the one.
Hmm. And they're perfectly imperfect,
Yeah.
right? What we love about it is just the nuance and the beauty in something that somebody else created. It's not about perfection, flawlessness, right? It's a
Yeah.
whole and complete thing that was made beautiful because it's imperfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of art and masterpieces, um, you have the you have the interpretation of that artist, and that's what makes it one of a kind. That's what makes it so beautiful.
Exactly. That's what makes it whole and complete and just absolutely precious, right? And so that framing helps me a lot to know that perfect means whole and complete. It doesn't mean flawless. Flawless is not something we can achieve. Perfection in the Industrial Revolution sense of the word is not achievable for human beings, nor should it be. Okay. So again, I want to say there's nothing wrong with having ideals. and striving towards ideals and stretching and growing and being able to see this ideal and move towards it. There's nothing wrong with that. I would encourage that in everybody,
Mhm.
right? But watch for that unhealthy, maladaptive type of perfectionism that we can easily fall into, which is about earning value and worth, which is something you cannot earn because it just is.
You know, the thing that came to my mind as you were describing that is my children,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like parenting has taught me this more than anything. And that's why I really need to let that soak into me as I'm looking at myself. Because if I really think of my children, I know their flaws. Um, Whether or not they get rid of those flaws or change those flaws does not, I mean, I want them to grow and I want them to develop into the best form of themselves for their most healthy life, right? But but my love for them is not dependent upon the complete removal of their flaws. I love them exactly the way they are, and I always have in their underdeveloped stage and as their development has continued. I've loved them at every single stage of their development.
Right? Because they're perfectly imperfect,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
And if you can do that as a human father, you know, how much more capable is a divine being to have that love for us? And like I said, it's a developmental skill to learn to find that self-love in that way. And so it's a process. So be kind to yourself as you learn.
Yeah, if if we can remember that to see divinity that way, um, loving parents, if this is a microcosm of what that is, then our mortal experience is to discover what it means to be divine.
Mhm.
And so, um,
Keyword discover, right?
that's
It's
right.
a process.
It is a
Mhm.
discovery. And in fact, the more I grow in parenting and eventually grandparenting, I'm sure there's more levels of this that I've got to discover. And it's okay. That's a part of my becoming, is learning, hey, my earlier flaws as a parent, I was doing the best that I could. And I can give that person grace.
Mhm.
And same for the other direction. As I continue to grow, I can be forgiving and I can give myself grace because
Well,
it's
I don't know if you noticed, Eric, that whole little speech right there was you being in a healthy, perfectionistic mindset.
hmm, hmm.
You just did it.
I'm the guinea pig for our
You are.
listeners.
You learned. You took it all in. Look at you.
Just right here. It just
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah, you got it.
I'm healed. In fact, we
You're
should
healed.
retire the
I'm
podcast.
sure that there will be no more unhealthy, maladaptive perfectionism ever in your system again,
Never,
right?
never again. I will
Which
not
just
have.
undermines everything we just talked about. Of course it will, right?
Yeah,
Of course it will. Yes,
yeah,
of course it will. But it's
absolutely.
such a beautiful process that we're all in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Jill. Thanks so much. In conclusion, is there anything that you feel you'd want to say to just as we wrap up this topic of perfectionism?
I think what I would just say is keep striving to understand who you are and how incredibly precious you are without having to do anything to earn that, because that's truth.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Well, as your brother, uh, I know your flaws. Not all of them, I'm sure, but I know you
I
got
don't,
some.
I don't have any. No, I'm the
Maladaptive.
exception. I'm the exception to this whole thing. No, I
Yeah,
have plenty. But you know what? I've learned to be okay with that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But have you always been that way?
No. Oh, heavens, no.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm recovering
Yep.
and in a process.
Myself
Hmm.
as well. And
Hmm.
I don't want it to be too personal for the
Mhm.
listeners, but I love you with your flaws. And
Thank you.
and that's what's great.
I
It's
love you with yours.
it's great to have a relationship like that where
Yeah,
in fact sometimes I just worry that we look at relationships and we think, well, if they have a flaw, it means that it is irreparable and that it means that there's something wrong. And if that were the truth, then there would be no human relationships. They would not
right.
exist.
They wouldn't.
Yeah.
They wouldn't. Yep. Eric, this has been fun.
It's been great. It's
Yeah,
been
I like
great. Well,
exploring this kind of stuff with you.
yeah, this will be great. So we'll end this now, but we want to thank all of our listeners. Thanks for being here. And we look forward to the next time that Jill and I unite for another podcast episode on a topic of her selecting. So it'll be
You
great.
can suggest some too. I'm
I
I'm
will.
open.
I
Okay.
will. We'll collaborate. We'll get those together. Maybe we'll open it up for our listeners too. We can have them suggest some topics for us, and
Yeah,
that'll be a lot of fun.
that'd be great. Okay.
Thanks, Jill. I'm glad we got this technology figured out too.
Oh my goodness.
Well, we
That was
hope.
a flawed process.
We'll see how it comes out in post. So,
Okay. Hopefully it does. Thanks,
okay,
Eric.
Jill, we'll talk to you later.
All right. We'll see
Bye.
ya. Bye.